Welcome to Talking Business Asia. Today, we're facing the worst pandemic in a century, our generation's Great Depression. By some estimates, close to $9 trillion of global economic output could be lost due to the coronavirus, and nearly half of the world's working population could potentially be out of a job. The statistics are stark, and I wouldn't blame anyone for thinking that the numbers simply don't make sense anymore. But one thing is for sure. This massive global health crisis is slowly but surely turning into the worst economic crisis any of us are likely to see in our lifetimes. The world has suffered financial crises before. We had the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis, SARS, and every single time we found a way back. So why is this time so different? Joining us today is the man who predicted the last global financial crisis, economist Nouriel Roubini from New York. Well, Professor Roubini, you're saying that even if we have any kind of recovery this year, the world is headed for a greater depression than the Great Depression in the 1930s, and that our economies are going to be saddled with even more debt. Why is this crisis so different from the ones we've had previously?
Well, we entered this crisis already with a large amount of private and public debt that are, for the world, over 300% of GDP. During the global financial crisis and even during the Great Depression of the 1930s, it took about 3 years until output fell sharply, unemployment rose sharply, consumption fell, capital spending fell. So it was a slow motion train wreck. This time around, it didn't take 3 years, not even 3 months. In 3 weeks, we had literally a free fall of both supply, demand, employment, every component of aggregate demand, import and exports. So this fall is unprecedented.
But we've also seen some unprecedented stimulus and support from governments around the world, and more likely to come. Won't that help?
It's going to make it shorter. We'll have a recession first and second quarter of this year, and there'll be a recovery of the economy starting the second half of the year. But, when unemployment rate is above 20%, we have lost in 2 months twice as many jobs as we created in the US in the previous 10 years. So we'll have a very anemic, subpar, below trend recovery.
Can you tell us what that means for the everyday person in the real economy?
Many of the job losses that have occurred are not going to go away. So all these jobs that are gone are going to come back only in part with lower wages, no benefits, part-time, and so on and so on. So there'll be even more insecurity of jobs and income and wages for the average working person. So it's going to be, again, a story where capital is going to do well, Wall Street is going to do well, profits are going to do well, but workers, wages, households are going to be worse off.
So what can policymakers do? What tools do they have?
Give less money to big corporations and to big banks. But in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, many of the effective policies at the margin help more Wall Street and the city and help less main streets, that is workers, households, and small businesses.
What do you think of some of the ideas out there, for instance, a new growth model, basic minimum income? Do you see those kinds of measures being introduced in some countries?
For a market economy to work, you need to have a very large, broad social safety net, because if you don't have it and you lose your job because either technology or a pandemic or another disaster causes you to lose your jobs, your income, your livelihood, then you need a safety net. And if you don't have that safety net, workers are going to say, I don't want to have globalization, I don't want to have trade.
We are starting to see some sort of a recovery in some parts of the world. Do you see then a global shift in leadership happening because of the fact that China has come out of this arguably better than the United States, for now at least?
After 9/11, the US led a coalition against terrorism. After the global financial crisis, the US led the policy response of all advanced economies and emerging markets. This time around, the US is missing in action. Today, the Chinese have said, if we find a vaccine, we're going to distribute it to the world. While Trump is saying, once we get the vaccine, first we're going to give it to every American before any foreigner is going to get even one dose of it. So that attitude means that the soft power of China is rising, the soft power of the United States is declining, and China is providing not just soft power, but also an economic, social, technological, and even political model that is not my model. It's state capitalism and authoritarian political system, but unfortunately it might be becoming more appealing to some parts of Asia.
Do you see then a fracture of this multilateral world that we've been used to for so long?
There is a decoupling between US and China. There is a deglobalization. There is a fragmentation of the global economy. And each one of them is going to say to the rest of the world, either you are with us or against us. Either you use my AI systems, my 5G, my technologies, my robotics, or you are using the one of my rival. And therefore, there's going to be a more divided world where Europe and others then will have to decide whether they want to go with the US or with China.
So what does that mean for Asia, the picture that you've just painted of this split, fractured world between the United States and China?
On the economic side, the US is doing nothing. On the security side now, the US tells even its allies, like Japan and Korea, you have to pay for the security I'm providing you. And on the political side, US is becoming literally less democratic. If the US doesn't provide on economic, on the financial, on the political, on the security, on the geopolitical side, a pivot so that this country can be engaged with the United States, whether they like it or not, they're going to gravitate in the direction of China, even if the economic system of China and the political system of China is not ideal from their point of view.
Before this crisis, Asia was very much the engine of global growth. Do you think it still will be after the pandemic?
Chinese growth that used to be 10% for 30 years now slowed down because of lots of structural factors to a potential that in my view is not greater than 5%. India could be rising, but have not done the macroeconomic and structural reform to increase potential growth from 7 to 8 or more. And last year, growth in India was only 4%. They've made many mistakes. So relatively speaking, emerging Asia is going to be better than other emerging market and advanced economies, but that should not lead to any sense of complacency because lots needs to be done, even in emerging Asia, to remain a very dynamic part of the global economy. And in a world that is deglobalized, small open economy that rely on a lot of foreign trade will have a challenge in terms of their model of economic growth.
Do you think that we're just simply going to move back to the way things were before, or is there an opportunity to press reset, to get this new normal, the way so many around the world have been asking for?
Well, things are not going to go back to normal. You can open the stores. The question is whether they're going to come back. You know, most of the shopping centers in China are still empty. Half of the flights are not there. In Germany, they reopened the store, but who wants to go and shop? And suppose you're an individual. You either lost your jobs or you have lower income or you could lose your job. Your income is lower. And in the US, 40% of Americans don't even have $400 for an emergency of savings. And therefore, you have less income and you have to save more in a precautionary way because this thing is going to come back. But I don't see yet any real driver and sense of this need to change completely our economic, social, and environmental model. Things will have to get worse before people are going to realize that there is the abyss in front of us, something of a catastrophe, and maybe then there'll be some collective action to change it. So unfortunately, I think they'll have to get worse before they get better.
Professor Roubini, thank you for your thoughts and for joining us on this program. That was Nouriel Roubini from New York. Welcome back to Talking Business Asia. Today, we're talking about economies in the post-pandemic world, and in particular, where Asia stands. Of course, our correspondents in the region have been living through all of this for the last few months, from lockdowns and homeschooling to stories of jobs lost and businesses shutting down. Now, they're seeing up close and personal what recovery means. Take a look.
it doesn't look like we're going to see a turning on of the tap this time round. No massive nationwide infrastructure build. Much of that's already been done, and the debt mountain is already considerably higher this time round. But we are seeing almost weekly moves to try and increase liquidity within the Chinese economy. Some interest rate cuts, all of that aimed at trying to encourage bank lending. Much of this is about keeping business afloat. Much of that is about keeping people in work. So the evidence is that in China's factories, the workforce is almost totally back, but it's nowhere near full capacity. Some of the evidence is they are moving outside of China after this corona shock, and there's been a resurgence in hostility emanating from Washington, D.C., and that will worry Beijing.
It's not business as usual yet, but Australia wants to open up the country as quickly as it can. Rules for each state differ, but gradually things like shops, cafes, restaurants and pubs are opening with restrictions. With no international tourists expected here for many months, there's going to be a big push towards domestic tourism. When it comes to kickstarting the economy, what many people hope not to see is Australia looking back to its abundant coal and natural gas industries. They say this is going to be a step backwards and a missed opportunity to try and invest in renewables.
The forecasts for Thailand are dire. GDP to shrink by almost 7%, up to 10 million jobs lost this year, and tourism, 1/5 of the economy, dead for many more months. The government is spending around $60 billion to try to keep the economy afloat. Now, around 1/4 of that is soft loans for small businesses, but they're finding them difficult to access. In desperation, the government's now called on 20 of the wealthiest tycoons to help. It isn't clear how, but it does illustrate just how much is still controlled by the largest businesses in this most unequal of societies.
The first thing to understand is that Japan has had no coronavirus lockdown. Throughout this period, the economy, much of it, has been kept open. Construction sites are still operating, factories are still rolling, and that could make it easier for Japan to ease out of this state of emergency compared to countries that have a really tight lockdown. But during this time, corporations have had to send hundreds of thousands of office workers home. They've had to adopt new technology, video conferencing, teleworking, and flexible working. So the question is, will Japanese corporations maintain this when the pandemic is over?
The Indian government says it will spend 10% of its GDP, that's nearly $266 billion, to revive the economy. But in reality, the actual amount could be much lesser because the plan is to repurpose and utilize existing welfare schemes and funds. The government plans to help small and medium businesses, migrant laborers, street vendors, as well as farmers. But many experts say that some of these schemes will only materialize over the next 1 year. Over 120 million people have lost their jobs over the last 2 months, and economists say that what India's poor need is cash in hand, and that too immediately.
So, where do we go from here? Joining me to answer that is Andy Xie, an independent economist based in Shanghai, and Jonathan Wutzel, director of the McKinsey Global Institute in Los Angeles today. First, Jonathan, let me start with you. You're a big believer in how Asia was first in and then first out and is now leading the way. What are you seeing that makes you so confident?
It's too soon to tell, but at least for some of the Asian economies, we see cautious optimism. I think would be the framing around the consumer. And on the industrial side, a capacity to protect and safeguard factories and livelihoods.
Asia has an advantage in the sense that it's production-based. So the West is more service-based. So and pandemic has a bit less impact. That means that we are very dependent on the global economy, global demand. So when the pandemic is curbing the demand in the West, it's not easy for us.
Jonathan, jump in.
Well, I agree with what Andy's saying, of course. But if we look at what Asia has to fall back on, it is the potential for growth domestically, first of all, much higher than in many other regions, simply because of the ongoing trends for urbanization and productivity growth, and as well as a fairly big cushion of savings and capital to be deployed from the region.
You know, China came to the rescue after the last global financial crisis, and now it seems to be trying to take on this sort of leadership role in this particular crisis and in the recovery. How big a role do you see it playing this time round?
This version round, I don't think China is planning on coming to its own rescue in that kind of way. In fact, if anything, it's being a lot more cautious in terms of how it's stimulating the economy. We've noticed that when a stimulus check is written, the next day the property price tends to go up. That's not the way we should do this. So they are actually staying much more focused, if you will, on the real economy. And with that, I'm optimistic, as I am, about reform. So I think if China has something to share with the rest of the world this time, it would be how you can, quote, see the opportunity in a crisis and change the economy.
Andy, your thoughts? What Jonathan's laid out there is an opportunity for China to reform. Is that likely?
Well, I think that right now the government's focus is not on changing the economic model. There's no doubt that the global economy depends on China's changing. Like Jonathan said, and 1.4 billion Chinese people should become proper consumers, not just workers, which is something that people have been talking about for a long time. I think that this governor was thinking about this a few years ago and finally made the decision to turn the other way, to focus on increasing social control rather than giving more money to the people to spend. So this is a political issue, not an economic issue. Now, with a lot of negative sentiment towards China, I think that the government is even less secure. So the odds of significant economic reforms are very low.
Where does that leave the rest of us, with obviously the United States still very much stuck in this as the global superpower of the day, and then the rival, China, still not being able to come out with a clear economic recovery, preoccupied with its own problems?
So the US has been on the wrong track for a long time. It's focusing on short-term things, focusing on financial bubbles. So I think the US is going to struggle for a long time. And it will take it out on China and focusing on decoupling as a way forward. So that is another dimension of uncertainty. The decoupling pressure will also make the Chinese government less secure. So it will not be focusing on the economic reforms. So the world will be stuck for quite a while. It's very difficult for anybody to replace China or the United States. And we need the politics to line up for major economic reforms to happen, for China to take its proper place to become the largest economy.
How much do you agree with the vision of what Andy's laid out?
This recovery, this moment of response, compare it back to 2003 or SARS, or even 2008 or 9, it's far more about the private sector than it ever was before. And I think it's almost demonstrated that China and Asia, without the private sector, can't survive. I would say that the private sector and competitiveness, this is well understood by Asian economies and by Asian policymakers. They can't kill the goose that lays the golden egg. If they want more golden eggs. And I think that is very important from a social stability point of view. I think we've all seen that when people's belly meets the backbone, they have nowhere to go but out in the street. So that's not something any political leader can support. And as a result, I think in many ways, China to some extent is locked in. It has to do more reform because that's the only way they're going to grow productivity. And that's the only way they're going to develop income. You can hold on it for a little while, but you can't hold on it forever. And I think Chinese people are not that patient.
How do you see this moving forward from here?
Yeah, I think that the U.S. is looking at the decoupling from China as a way forward. Doesn't matter if it works or not, it's being sold to American people. So it will happen to some extent, and it will force global companies to move the supply chain out of China and into other countries. So that would make products for the US and probably for other Western countries higher because they are concerned about China's dominance in the supply chain. So that's fair. If you're willing to pay a price for a peace of mind, it's fine. But I think that other poor countries, developing countries, don't have this choice. They have to go to China for cheap things like Africa or South Asia or Middle East. So that means that the world is moving towards two-price system. it means less efficiency and therefore a slower growth.
Is that what you see, Jonathan?
The other side of this is these economies have become more capable. Their supply chains have deepened. So the things that they used to import, the intermediate goods, they have less need for that as there is more local value added. So both from the market side and from the supply chain side, what we can say is that Asia is becoming more Asian and China is becoming more Chinese. And I think that is maybe, if we want to call that decoupling, fine. But what it's expressing is actually a dynamic of economic development.
What do you think will define the next few years more, the coronavirus crisis or this hostility that we see brewing between the United States and China? Andy?
I think we are entering 2 years of like a constant talking about bigger power competition and what China will do, what the US will do. That's not very good for economic development. The government everywhere becoming much more powerful than before. That has far-reaching implications for how the market will work in the future. So I think that is that a positive or negative is yet to be seen.
Jonathan?
I think that there's simply more and better educated and more capable leaders. There's more human capital and there's more marketplace in Asia. And that story of that developing marketplace and that developing capability will be the story that drives Asian growth. But I wouldn't count out the private sector. That's really the growth. That's where the opportunity is for China and for Asia to raise the quality of life and the standard of living for every one of its consumers and workers. And without that, nothing is guaranteed.
Thank you, Andy Xie in Shanghai, Jonathan Wetzel, for joining us on this program. Well, that brings us to the end of our show. From me and the rest of the team, stay safe and healthy, and thanks for watching.